Hey everybody, this is the first section, the first chapter of Charlie Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, third period, 1930 to 1941, part 2, The Dominators. Chapter 1 is titled The Political and Legal Ideology. I'm also going to be reading the preface in this video and the table of contents. So part 1 of the book is titled Absolute Secretary and the Proletarian Fetish. Section 1 is titled Ideological Themes and Practices of Stalinism. Chapter 1 is titled The Political and Legal Ideology, and it has the headings, the quote, legal role of the party, end quote, the quote, cult of the party and its chief, end quote, the fetishism of the state, the Stalinist thesis of strengthening the state, negation of the quote, repressive function of the state, end quote, state rights of the individual in the 1936 Constitution, the specific form of Stalinist state fetishism and Bolshevik ideology, Soviet state as successor to the Russian state, the Russian nationalist component of the ideological formation of Stalinism, Stalinist nationalism and the Tsarist imperial past, the 1936 Constitution, and Russian nationalism, nationalism, elitism, and national Bolshevism. Chapter 2 is titled Economic Ideology of Stalinism. 1. Socialist mode of production. 2. Socialist ownership. 3. Planned economy. 4. Quote, economic laws of socialism, end quote. Part 2 of the book is titled How the Stalinist Formulations Worked, and the headings are Pseudoscience and Dogmatism, and Flight Away from the Real and the Mystique of the Party. Part 3 of the book is titled The Practical Ideology of Stalinism and Its Social Effects. And the headings are, the chapters are Spectre of a Conspiracy, The Ideology of Terror in the Soviet Ideological Formation, The Two Codes of Stalinist Ideology, Code of Interpretation, Code of Allegiance. And then there's an annexure titled Are Human Rights Marxist? Part 2, The Dominators in Twilight, 1928 to 1938. Part 1 of Part 2 is titled The quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, 1928 to 1931. Section 1, Cultural Revolution as Class War. 1. The decisions and measures which install and support the policy of preference. Recruitment of, quote, specialists before the implementation of the, quote, promotion policy, end quote. The immediate causes for the shift in 1928. Chapter 2. Effects of promotion policy on the structure of the new dominating class and on the working class. 3. Repression against the, quote, old intelligentsia, end quote. 2. The earliest attempts by the leading group to, quote, usurp party, end quote. The resolution of the plenum of April 1929. 2. The, quote, deviations, end quote, and action of the, quote, class enemies, end quote. 3. The Lamanidze and Sirtsov, quote, affair. I want to look that up, actually, before we move on, because that is something that I have no idea what the hell that is. The Lomenidze and Sirtsov affair, better known as the Sirtsov-Lomenidze affair, was a significant event in the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1930. It represented a failed attempt to oppose the increasingly centralized power of Joseph Stalin. This is also known as the left-right bloc. In the history of the Soviet Union, in the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the left-right bloc was a failed attempt of vocal opposition to the politics of forced collectivization of Joseph Stalin. Vissarion, Lomenidze, and Sergei Sirtsov were recognized as its leaders. The name is derived from the accusation in factionism of the group, created by joining of two groups, the one accused, quote, in right opportunism, end quote, allegedly headed by Sirtsov, and another accused of, quote, leftism and, quote, half-Trotskyism, end quote, allegedly headed by Lomenidze. In Western literature, the case is known as the Sirtsov-Lomenidze affair. Back to the text. 3. The, quote, retreat, end quote, of the years 1931 to 1934. And the chapters include Open Rise of Conservatism. And the headings are Abandonment of, quote, Cultural Revolution in Production. 2. Abandonment of, quote, Cultural Revolution in Literature and Art. 2. Consolidation of the position of the cadres and the increase in their privileges. 3. Resistance to the, quote, usurpation of the party, end quote. The, quote, Rintin affair. The hell's the Rintin affair? Anyway, I can't find anything for it. Ordzhonikidze's resistance to various aspects of the, quote, industrial line of the Gensec, its conditions and effects, the new situation, and the 17th Congress, the debate on the, quote, revolutionary legality, end quote. Section Part 4, hardening of dictatorship of the leading group on the party and on the cadres, December 1934 to summer 1936. 1. The earliest wave of terror let loose on the members of the party and the cadres, December 1934 to summer 1936. 1. The appointment to new positions of the highest responsibility in reorganization. The start of terror against the members of the party and the cadres. Chapter 2. The unleashing and growth of terror on a large scale against the cadres, summer 1936 to the 1938 end. And the headings, March 1937 plenum and the large-scale renewal of the cadres, the NKVD and the purge of the cadres, the administrative and economic chaos. 3. The extent of renewal of the cadres, the quantitative aspect of renewal, the qualitative aspect. Part 3 of the book, Party Bourgeoisie is established. Part 1, Changes in the Party. 1. Renewal of the leadership of the party and of its cadres. 2. The renewal of the membership of the party. 3. Changes in the manner of working of the party. Chapter 2. Process of consolidation/subjugation of the new dominating class. 1. The terror and the process of consolidation/subjugation of the new dominant class. 1. Subjugation as a counterpart of powers and privileges. 2. Subjugation of cadres and, quote, sharpening of class struggle, end quote. The system of Chirago. Section 2. Unity and contradiction of the dominating class. Subjugation to the leading group and formation of a party bourgeoisie. 3. Rise in the privileges of the new dominating class. 3. The changes Chapter 3, changes in the relationship of the party with the dominating class. The forms of subordination of the managers of industry to the party and the party's leadership. Industrial management and the role of the party in the enterprises on the eve and in the beginning of the first 5-year plan. Idea of merging the management of the enterprises and the party. Setting up of industrial sections, 1930, and its effects. New attempts to have recourse to control over the directors of enterprises by the primary organization of the party, March 1939. The reconstitution of the, quote, production sections, and, quote, the forms of direct subjugation of the managers and engineers to the leading group. 2. Rapid penetration of the new dominating class in the party and the class of the 1930s. 1. The statutes adopted at the 18th Congress and the, quote, Soviet intellectuals, and, quote, the, quote, renewal, and, quote, of the intelligentsia and the changes of statutes. 3. Some figures concerning the entry of the new dominating class with the party. Section 4. Specific nature of the new dominating class. Internal contradictions in the new bourgeoisie. 1. Contradictions between the apparatuses. 2. National fractions of Soviet bourgeoisie. Solidarity groups and, quote, clientelism. Chapter 2, the party and regulation of contradictions internal to the new dominating class. 1. The nomenclatura. 1. The nomenclatura. 2. Domination, social exploitation, and political leadership. Chapter 3, hierarchization of the dominating class and its, quote, bureaucratic character. 4. Redoubling of the different apparatuses by the party and the status of this party. 4. Quote, party capitalism, and, quote, and its specific traits. Part 4 of the book. Rather Hitler than emancipation of the people. 1. The period 1928 to 1934, denunciation of the Entente countries and the struggle against the social fascism. The struggle against, quote, social fascism, and, quote, denunciation of the Entente countries and the German policy of the USSR, Soviet steps to avoid a confrontation with Germany. Chapter 2, contradictions of the Soviet foreign policy and the political line of the Communist International, 1934 to 1939. 1. Nationalist ideology and the foreign policy of the USSR. The 8th Congress of the Communist International, the 7th Congress of the Communist International and its consequences, the Civil War in Spain and the Soviet, quote, aid to the Spanish Republic, objectives of Soviet diplomacy, place of the Spanish War in the international policy of the USSR, Soviet diplomatic initiatives and the international situation in Europe towards a German-Soviet pact. Chapter 3, Years of German-Soviet Pact, August 1939 to June 1941. The quote, Entente with Hitler and territorial expansion of the USSR in the autumn of 1939. 2. The pact, Soviet diplomacy and the Communist parties. 3. Territorial expansion of the USSR in the beginning of 1940. The progressive transformation of German-Soviet relations. 5. The beginning of war. Postface, in order not to conclude. 1. Some major events of 1953 and the years that followed. 2. Continuity and change in the political system and practices. Relative effacement of the role of security organs and state terror. Substitution of an oligarchical leadership in place of an autocratic leadership. Policy of detente. 3. Continuity and change in Soviet ideology, leadership role of the party and denunciation of the, quote, cult of personality, relative setback of dogmatism, ideological relations of the population with the power. 4. Continuity and change in economy. 5. General crisis of the system. Here we go. Preface to the French edition. Stalinism as a whole amounts to a system. The 30s deals with an especially complex and rapidly changing reality. It needed a type of investigation which cannot be seen in its manner of presentation. The results of our analysis of Stalinism and of Stalinism's true nature are therefore given in 2 volumes. The first volume was devoted to the dominated, such as the peasants, the workers, the repression and mass terror to which the peasants and workers were exposed, and the accumulation of the capital which the peasants and workers were the victims. The analysis of Part 1, the dominated, revealed that during the 1930s a series of attacks were launched against the, quote, Soviet working class and peasantry. Indeed, the peasantry had practically even ceased to exist as such once collectivization was brought about. We also noticed the arrival in the world of a new form of capitalism where mass repression, terror, and penal work on large scale in the concentration camps had played an extraordinary role. The rise of this capitalism is accompanied by crises of overproduction of a peculiar nature. This second volume deals with the Dominators. The Dominators' ideology and the changes it underwent during the 1930s, with the forms of existence of a new class, with the historical conditions leading to its formation, the role of the party, and with the international policy of the USSR. Footnote: the general pattern of the work is thus as follows. Volume 1, the early period, 1917 to 1923. Volume 2, the second period, 1923 to 1930. The third period, 1930 to 1941, the Dominated Part 1, and the Dominators Part 2. End footnote. This manner of treatment gives clarity to our purpose. On the other hand, it leads to some repetitions needed for an understanding of the linkages between different elements and factors that constitute Stalinism from the bottom to the top. We request the reader not to hold it against us. Part 1. Absolute Secretary and the Proletarian Fetish. The consolidation of positions by the new ruling class and its subjugation to a political direction comprising the leadership of the state and of the party, which had itself become an administrative apparatus, is accompanied by a new official ideology. It insists on its being identical to Bolshevism and to Leninism, but in reality, its distinctive traits are of such an importance as to constitute a new formation which can be described as the Stalinist ideological formation. Because this new formation takes its birth in the USSR during the period when Stalin occupied a dominant place on the Soviet political scene, while seeming to appear in the nature of a continuation of the Bolshevik ideological formation. Further, the General Secretary plays a decisive role in the formation of this new ideology. One second. I gotta get to I have a footnote here I gotta get to. We may conveniently denote by, quote, Stalinism, end quote, this ideological formation, and by the, quote, Stalinist system, end quote, the system of social relationships in the countries where, quote, Stalinism, end quote, with more or less, quote, new, end quote, modalities, plays a major role in the dominant ideological and political practices. Let's see if I can get to this footnote now. Alright, I'm having some trouble here. Sorry, one second. Footnote. In the last part of Volume 2 of this work, 1923 to 1930, I had partially anticipated the changes in the Bolshevik ideological formation during the 1930s. I will not repeat here the analysis which I have presented there. However, it now appears to me more correct to speak of Stalinist social formation, to speak Stalinist ideological formation, in order to account for the bearing of the changes undergone by official ideology from the 1930s. End footnote. The influence of Stalinism operates quite beyond the frontiers of the USSR and beyond the years 1930 to 1953. In changed forms, it is active even today. Footnote. The date of publication of the book is March 1983. Translator. End footnote. In the Soviet Union, as also in other countries led by parties claiming to belong to the different variants of a, quote, Marxism-Leninism, end quote, by reproducing some of the fundamental traits of Stalinist conceptions. This is in evidence in countries as different as those of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, from Poland to Albania, Romania, Cuba, Vietnam, Cambodia, or China, etc. In these different countries, the Stalinist ideological formation influences official ideology more or less profoundly, even while it undergoes transformations linked to the political culture of these countries, to the internal social and political contradictions, and to the more or less acute contradictions which exist between them and the Soviet Union. Furthermore, depending on each case, this official ideology can exert an effective influence on the decisions of the parties in power, or can be used for waging polemics which is only distantly related to the practical decisions of the leaders. Similarly, the response to this ideology in the different classes or strata of the population of these countries can be quite different, and as an extreme case, it can be almost inexistent. The role of these polemics there's some typos here. The role of these polemics is in no way less real. It serves to legitimize the practice of power, and with help from the repression, it stands in the way of a critical debate which gets marginalized as a result, pulverized and put down. However, the Stalinist ideological formation also has an influence over parties or over political groupings in a struggle for power in order to set up an economic and social system more or less similar to the one obtaining in the USSR. These parties then claim to be one variety or other of, quote, Marxism-Leninism, end quote, by adopting certain traits of Stalinist theory, pretending at the same time to denounce the, quote, abuses or the, quote, errors committed in the USSR during the Stalinist era. Generally speaking, such parties put forth somewhat changed forms of the Stalinist formation. They often adapt and modify topical themes of the ideological discourses of the Soviet, Cuban, Chinese, or Vietnam parties. The impact of such variants of Stalinist ideology is mainly felt in the countries with little industrialization. They can influence strong movements of national liberation, which does not mean in any way that they always really help the liberation of these countries. Indeed, far from it, end parenthesis. Footnote, in any case, they did not help such a liberation when they let their country fall in the sphere of Soviet domination once they capture power. End footnote. These observations would show that the problems posed by the Stalinist ideological formation retain their relevance to our times. However, their non-Soviet and contemporary aspects are beyond the scope of this work. We shall be mainly concerned here with the Stalinist ideological formation of the period 1930 to 1953, but mostly up to 1941. This ideological formation includes a partly theoretical discourse and practices sustained by specific discourses which we shall examine for their chief aspects, without forgetting that they evolve over time when the dominant social and political relations in the USSR undergo a transformation depending on the periods and major contradictions that characterize them. Footnote. Of course, I leave aside an examination of the Soviet ideology of the post-1950 3 years. I will content myself with a few brief observations on this subject. A. The official ideology of these years has seen serious changes, but they are nonetheless a product of the Stalinist formation because the main themes of Stalinism are still at work. B. The relationship of the Soviet leaders to this ideology has undergone a deep change. It hardly seems to dictate their decisions, or it does so under other forms. Thus, contemporary Soviet expansionism is more directly related to the internal contradictions of the system and to Russian nationalism and Russian nationalism's aspirations for wider international hegemony based on a relationship of military forces favorable to Russia rather than to a, quote, international revolutionary, end quote, role, which the USSR thought it played through the Communist International. However, in a changed form, Stalinist ideology can still be used to, quote, legitimize, end quote, the policy adopted by the Soviet leaders. C. The credibility of the theoretical themes of Stalinist ideology among the workers of the USSR was always low. During the last 2 decades, it has almost vanished. End footnote. An examination of these changes during the years 1928 to 1953 leads to a rough and provisional periodization. This periodization is based upon tracing the most visible displacements of certain ideological themes. It will thus appear that between 1928 and 1931, 2 ideological themes dominate. One of the destruction of the remnants and the bases of capitalism, parenthesis, collectivization, elimination of the private sector, quote, dekulakizing, end quote, end parenthesis, and the other of the, quote, proletarianization, end quote, of the party, of the state apparatus and of culture, denoted by the expression, quote, cultural revolution, end quote. We shall later describe these characteristics and limits. Footnote, Sheila Fitzpatrick's book, Cultural Revolution in Russia, 1928 to 1931, published in Bloomington, published in 1978, will be found especially instructive for this period. The description book for this book says, China's Cultural Revolution of the 1960s had an important precedent in the Soviet Union during the first 5-year plan, when established authorities and institutions in culture and the professions came under attack from militant communist intellectuals. One of the most challenging questions for the student of this turbulent era is the actual nature of the revolution. Was it, quote, revolution from above, and, quote, initiated and controlled by the party leadership, or, quote, revolution from below, and, quote, brought on by Marxist radicals within the cultural professions and pressure from an upwardly mobile working class? This important book focused on the transition from the NEP to Stalinism, presents both sides of the vigorous current debate. Back to the text and footnote. This period sees the beginning of the, quote, setting up, end quote, of the working class. The working class's subjugation to an increasingly severe factory discipline and the strengthening of the authority and privileges of the managers. These traits of Stalinist ideology are reinforced during the period 1932 to 1934, which is characterized by the, quote, struggle against egalitarianism, end quote, and by the accent that it places on acquisition of technical skills. From 1935 to 1938, there is a third period during which the dominant themes of the unity of the party, which in practice is subject to extremely brutal repression, the necessities of its, quote, monolithism, end quote, struggle against saboteurs, plotters, and traitors who have infiltrated within its ranks. It is the period when the glorification of the personality of Stalin takes a concrete shape. It is also the period which witnesses an open development of Russian nationalistic themes and the glorification of Russian traditional values. These years coincide with a sort of permanent coup d'etat by Stalin. Stalin has most of the older leaders of the party arrested and replaced by men who appear to Stalin to be more devoted to Stalin personally. Lastly, from 1939 onwards begins a more conservative period where the glorification of Stalin and the glorification of national and traditional values tends to coalesce and get an edge over the references to, quote, Marxism, end quote. This conservatism is further reinforced during the war. It is imposed by circumstances to some extent, but it gets entrenched in the defense of the new social order and of the privileges that characterize it. It is fed on the assertion that the, quote, socialist mode of production, end quote, is now established and henceforth it is a matter mostly of perfecting it. However, economic and political contradictions that arise in the aftermath of war lead to a new ideological thrust, radical in appearance, which points, for example, to the theme of, quote, proletarian science, end quote. The post-war period is beyond the scope of this work. Footnote. On this point, the book of D. Lecourt on the development of this theme through the episode of Lysenkoism in 1948. See Lecourt, Lysenko, published in Paris, 1976. It looks like this book was translated into English or something like it, called Proletarian Science, The Case of Lysenko by Dominique Lecourt, with an introduction by Althusser. The description of this book says, the Soviet agronomist Trofim Lysenko, who died in 1976, symbolized one of the most notorious yet obscure episodes in the history of the Soviet Union. Emerging from provincial shadows in the Ukraine during the 1920s, Lysenko achieved a meteoric career under Stalin's dictatorship when ever greater claims were officially made for his, quote, environmentalism, end quote. Overlord and autocrat of all Soviet biology after the Second World War, Lysenko's doctrines were promulgated throughout the international communist movement from Britain to Japan as a specifically, quote, proletarian, end quote, science, as opposed to mere bourgeois science. After Stalin's death, Lysenko soon plunged in discredit, although these agricultural recipes were to be approved again by Khrushchev. Dominique Lecourt, author of the highly successful study, Marxism and Epistemology, poses the question, what was the historical meaning of Lysenko? Was Lysenko no more than a brutal charlatan, or did Lysenko's ideas correspond not to any canon of science, but to wider social forces at work in the USSR? Lecourt's sardonic and perceptive study provides a definitive critique of the follies of, quote, anti-Mendelian end quote, biology, and a materialist account of the reasons for its triumph in Russia during the rule of Stalin. An important afterword traces the original idea of proletarian science to its source in Bogdanov. In a major introductory essay, Louis Althusser poses the acute political problems which the history of Lysenko still represents for communists everywhere, and for the first time directly indicts political repression in the USSR today. Back to the text and footnote. The post-war period is beyond the scope of this work. The above-mentioned indications point to certain aspects of the complexity of Stalinist ideology. This complexity is also related to two types of facts. One, with respect to the overwhelming mass of population, it is essentially an official ideology and not merely the dominant ideology. It functions more through constraints than through conviction, so much so that the degree of subordination of different classes and layers of society to this ideology is highly variable. Stalinist ideology functions more through constraints than through conviction, so much so that the degree of subordination of different classes and layers of society to Stalinist ideology is highly variable. This has its repercussions on the way Stalinist ideology functions and the forms that Stalinist ideology assumes. 2. It is a peculiarly contradictory combination of themes, some of which are borrowed from Bolshevism and others from Russian political culture, and of practices that are in part refuted by ideological discourse. It is peculiarly contradictory. Stalinist ideology is a peculiarly contradictory combination of themes, some of which are borrowed from Bolshevism and others from Russian political culture, and of practices that are in part refuted by ideological discourse. So here we are, Chapter 1, Ideological Themes and Practices of Stalinism. So I might have misspoke before. This might be a section from a chapter that I plan on reading. But we'll see. I don't know. I just don't want to make a video that's too long. Ideological themes and practices of Stalinism. A preliminary observation is necessary. The inability of the official ideology to function as the dominant ideology has resulted in the dominant ideology in the USSR in the 1930s, and this is true even now, being the same as the one dominating the rest of the capitalist world, albeit with its specificities. This ideology tends to produce the same fundamental effects. They accept the social relationships and power such as they exist. However, the dominant ideology is clothed in the USSR in very specific forms, which will be discussed briefly when we deal with the Soviet ideological formation during the Stalin era. These forms are related to the very history of Russia and of the countries under Russia's yoke, to the history of the class struggles witnessed in the USSR and in the interaction of official ideology and dominant ideology. The latter contributes to the growth of the influence of the former, because both are ideologies of subjugation to power. However, the dominant ideology enters at the same time into contradiction with the official ideology and is an essential element of its weak influence, especially insofar as it carries individualist values, while the official ideology leans towards a complete subordination of the individual before the decisions of the party, which is presented as an instrument of history leading the proletariat from victory to victory. This observation becomes highly meaningful when we examine the different areas in which discourse of the official ideology unfolds. So I was right, yeah, what I'm reading is, what I plan on reading is actually a section instead of a chapter. So this first section is titled Political and Legal Ideology. So I guess this video will be part 1 of chapter 1. Anyway. One of the dominant themes of Stalinist ideology is that of the leading role of the party. One of the dominant themes of Stalinist ideology is that of the leading role of the party. Its constant presence in the major place that the party occupies make the party the fundamental element of this ideology. New heading. Heading 1. The, quote, leading role of the party, end quote. Having identified the party with the proletariat, the party's dictatorship is postulated as essential for the, quote, construction and, quote, consolidation of socialism. The party's role is presented as a necessity dictated by the, quote, objective laws of history, end quote, because the party is supposed to carry knowledge indispensable for the victory over capitalism and over the, quote, enemies of the people, end quote. I might be wrong, but this sounds very much like what Lukács says about the party. It's like the party is being like dictated by objective laws of history or something like that. Maybe I'm wrong, though. I'm not a Lukács expert. Its role is presented as a necessity dictated by the, quote, objective laws of history, end quote, because it's supposed to carry knowledge indispensable for the victory over capitalism and over, quote, the enemies of the people, end quote. The assertion of the leading role of the party was already at work in the Bolshevik ideological formation and in Leninism, but it had a different appearance. On the one hand, it referred to a position of principle, to the identification of the proletariat and the proletariat's vanguard. It is a matter of, quote, substitutionism, end quote, which leads to the assertion that the proletariat exerts the proletariat's dictatorship as soon as the party has captured power. Parenthesis, hence the founding myth of October, end parenthesis. It tends to concentrate the power in the Bolshevik Party by asserting that it incarnates the historical mission of the proletariat as such, as it was conceived in the entire Marxist tradition. It tends to concentrate the power in the Bolshevik Party by asserting that it incarnates the historical mission of the proletariat such as it was conceived in the entire Marxist tradition. On the other hand, it was also a throwback on a certain interpretation of concrete history. It asserts the simultaneity of the vanguard of the proletariat and the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. However, during the period of Lenin, this coincidence was not postulated as definitely achieved. The idea that the Bolshevik Party can be seen as incapable of assuming the role assigned to it by the official ideology, that it can cease to be the, quote, vanguard of the proletariat, end quote, and that it may even be necessary to create another communist party, was not theoretically excluded, parenthesis, as it was mentioned in 1918 or 1919, for example, in parenthesis. On the contrary, such eventualities were not envisaged by Stalinist ideology, which considers the party is implicitly, by the party's very nature, capable, and the only capable party, of propounding the correct political line based upon scientific principles. The leading role of the party becomes increased in the ideological formula which marks the emergence of a new form of state. The leading role of the party becomes increasingly the ideological formula which marks the emergence of a new form of state. The state is led not, quote, by the party, end quote, but by a self-appointed politico-ideological oligarchy, very restricted in number and which can at certain moments be closely dependent on the person seen to be its chief. In this form of state, the, quote, leading lights of the party intervene essentially to ratify decisions of the dominant oligarchy on which the, quote, leading lights of the party are dependent. The members of this group are named and dismissed by the small circle of top leaders. The party thus becomes an apparatus through which the oligarchy dominates the state. This oligarchy is answerable to none. This oligarchy controls all the, quote, mass organizations, end quote, and even the, quote, private life, end quote, of each. This oligarchy asserts itself as the only one knowing science and the only one to lay down law. The state that this oligarchy leads tends to be totalitarian. Everything should be subordinate to the state. And whatever seeks to go against the state can be termed as enemy activity, parenthesis, under the label of the, quote, enemy of the people, end quote, quote, counter-revolutionary, end quote, etc., end parenthesis, punishable by death or deportation, etc. This image of the party and the party's relationship to power, to law, and to knowledge is in an embryonic state in the Bolshevik ideology, but the totalitarian practice of the party has its full development in the Stalinist era, when the top leadership seeks to control how anyone shall think, imposes his behavior on him, and makes him a simple clog in the, quote, machine, end quote, of the society and the state. This totalitarian practice hides the real inability of the party in effectively mastering the social processes which the party seeks to direct. This totalitarian practice hides the real inability of the party in effectively mastering the social processes which the party seeks to direct. Such an inability only makes the party's attempts at, quote, universal, end quote, control on the state apparatus or social groups and on individuals more violent. If the figure of the, quote, leading party, end quote, is associated with a new form of state, it begins to assert itself only between October 1917 and the beginning of the 1930s. It is in the course of these last years that the state of a new type takes shape in real terms, thus giving an illusion that the Soviet formation of the 1930s is itself radically new, that it is based upon a, quote, economic basis, end quote, of a non-capitalist type. We have seen that this illusion corresponds in no way to reality. It can, however, draw upon a postulate that seeks to establish a necessary link between the emergence of a new form of state and the development of a, quote, economic base, end quote, which would also be so. Stalinism has widely used this illusion to assert the, quote, socialist, end quote, character of the Soviet system. The recourse to such a postulate may appear to justify certain passages of Marx, especially the one where he declares, quote, it is always in the immediate relationship between the masters of the means of production and the direct producers that we must seek the closed secret. This is a typo. The hidden basis of the entire social structure, as also the political form of the relationships of sovereignty and dependence, or in short, the form of state at a given historical period, end quote. Marx. There's a footnote that I missed that said, in the following pages, the citations illustrating the various themes of Stalinist ideology have been kept limited as much as possible, because many of them appear later in the pages devoted to the transformation of political relationships. A specific illustration of it can be found in the proceedings of the 17th and 18th Congress of the Party, and in the newspapers of that period, especially from 1935 and on the occasion of the Great Moscow Trials. End footnote. Concrete historical analysis leads to doubts being entertained about such a postulate and the conclusions which can be drawn from it by Bolshevism and Stalinism. In the USSR of the 1930s, the theme of the leading role of the party refers to a reality and a practice. The theme of the leading role of the party is an ideological symbolism, under which the dominant role of the leadership of the party is represented and asserted in state structures as a whole. The theme of the leading role of the party is an ideological symbolism under which the dominant role of the leadership of the party is represented and asserted in state structures as a whole. The theme tends to set up, without saying so, the leadership of the party into a higher organ of state power. It tends to legitimize implicitly the activity of the leadership of the party, which prepares and in fact elaborates laws and decrees, which tries to control all the limbs of the state, which decides the appointment, promotion, and dismissal of the highest cadres, and which thus ensures through appropriate organs of the state the manner in which these cadres fulfill the tasks which devolve upon them. But the theme of the, quote, leading role, end quote, of the party also hides at the same time this reality, by letting it be understood that the party does not dominate the state and contents itself with merely guiding the state. From it arises, for example, the themes developed in chapters 3 and 8 of the Constitution of 1936, which enumerate the different organs of power. These chapters of the Constitution announce that the Supreme Soviet is the, quote, highest organ of state power, end quote. That the Supreme Soviet concentrates all the rights of the Union, and that the Supreme Soviet has the, quote, exclusive, end quote, exercise of legislative power. Article 33. These chapters specify in detail the composition and the mode of election of the state organs. They even foresee the adoption of laws, quote, by simple majority, end quote. Article 39, while in practice, quote, unanimity, end quote, is established since long. The role as, quote, highest organ of the state power, end quote, assigned by the Constitution to the Supreme Soviet is pure fiction and is in contradiction with facts. In real practice, as pointed out, this, quote, highest organ, end quote, is the leadership of the party. The Constitution of 1936, in an indirect and camouflaged way, allows it to be so because its text contains, within brackets as it were, a proposition which practically gives full powers to the party. One may draw attention to a sentence in Article 126, where it is said that the Communist Party of the USSR is the, quote, vanguard of the workers, end quote, which, quote, represents the directing core of all the organizations of workers, social as well as of the state, end quote. This amounts to saying that the Supreme Soviet, like any other organization, is governed by the party and should conform to the party's requirements. Article 126 of the Constitution further makes it clear that the leading role of the party concerns not only the organs of power, but all the activities of the citizens. It is under the ideological form that we see the generalized domination of the party on all the social organizations, Komsomols, pioneers, trade unions, women's associations, writers' union, association for scientific knowledge, etc. During the 1930s, the theme of the, quote, leading role of the party, end quote, is developed in a quasi-obsessional manner because of the acuteness of the economic and political contradictions which the party was trying to confront. The theme of the, quote, leading role of the party, end quote, makes it possible to use the thesis of Marx on the historical mission of the proletariat, which becomes the, quote, mission, end quote, of the leadership of the party. The character of, quote, historical necessity, end quote, attributed to this mission implied that it need not depend upon the risks inherent in the elections. Therefore, the elections can only be a symbolic gesture seeking a, quote, ratification, end quote, of the decisions of the party by the, quote, verdict of the ballot box, end quote. It does not even allow that a veritable popular check operate on it and on its decisions. If there is a check at all, it can only be symbolic. It does not seek to limit the initiatives of the leadership, but in fact, reinforces the leadership's authority by a semblance of democracy. The theme of the leadership role of the party seeks to justify the monopoly of the leadership, bracket, and, increasingly, of its chief, parenthesis, vajda, and parenthesis, personality. Let me repeat that. The theme of the leadership of the role of the party seeks to justify the monopoly of the leadership, and increasingly that of the leadership's chief, vajda, which is the Russian word for chief, personally, not only in political, economic, and administrative decisions, but in all the fields. The role of the vajda, chief, extends also to the sciences, to literature, and the arts. This extension of the role of the chief constitutes a specific trait of Stalinist ideology. The post-Stalinist ideology tends, but only tends, to limit the ideological, quote, monopoly, end quote, of the party to enunciating the so-called, quote, correct, end quote, formulation in the domain of policies and Marxist theory. Although the present CPSU does not hesitate either, in several cases, to decide what is, quote, right in the domain of literature and the arts. 2. The, quote, cult of the party and its chief, end quote, new section. By postulating that only the leadership of the party can lay down what is, quote, true and, quote, just, Stalinist ideology raises it to a, quote, higher entity, end quote, which should be respected by all. This obligatory respect soon changes into a, quote, cult in actual practice through an insistence on an absolute allegiance on the part of the members of the party to the decisions of the party's leadership and on a behavior in conformity to the directives of the party on the part of workers, peasant scientists, writers, artists, filmmakers, etc. This cultural practice in the beginning is placed at the level of guidelines for behavior. It is formally imposed through repetitions of the same phrases glorifying the, quote, scientific and, quote, historical character of the decisions of the party, and even more, through the watch on the population, the omnipresence of the police, and through a general recourse to spying. At some moments, this practice tends to become obligatory to an extent because of the disarray and disquiet in the population, which is reassured with the thought that there exists an authority which knows how to prepare for a better future. The mode of functioning of the party, which is its extreme centralization, results in its authority appearing to be identified with that of the Politburo and the General Secretary. The more the leadership of the party is centralized, the more the, quote, cult, end quote, of the leadership of the party. The more the leadership of the party is centralized, the more the, quote, cult, end quote, of the leadership of the party's authority assumes a personal character. The cult is accepted by the group of leaders, by cages of the party, and by the dominating class. And so, not only because it is imposed by the mode of functioning of the party and police repression, but also because their domination can be consolidated only by chasing away all disagreements, by avoiding to the maximum the risk of statements other than those certified as, quote, correct, end quote, getting spread. Under these conditions where, quote, monolithism, end quote, becomes a principle, it becomes necessary that the supreme leader of the party monopolize the power to decide what is true and what is false. The vajda must therefore appear as the incarnation of wisdom, of science, and even of all knowledge, the one who solves all the problems without any dispute, in the light of, quote, Marxism-Leninism, end quote, in the domain of, quote, political economy of socialism, end quote, of biology or linguistics, of literature or painting, of the theater and cinema. Footnote: literature and cinema are especially held in respect as the means of shaping the spirit of the masses. During the first Congress of the Union of Writers, the phrase of Stalin according to which the writers are the, quote, engineers of the soul, end quote, is repeated ad nauseum. And the role of the leaders of the Union, parenthesis, like the censor, in parenthesis, is to keep watch that the, quote, engineers, and, quote, fulfill their task in the manner the leadership of the party understands it. It will be borne in mind, furthermore, that in 1924, Stalin repeated the idea of Lenin, but expressed it in harsher words, quote, the cinema is the most effective tool for stirring the masses. Our problem is to know how this tool should be handled, unquote. See the article by Gay Lida, The Stalinist Cinema, published in Kino. In the beginning of the 1930s and also later, each film is examined in the Kremlin for an assurance that it is, quote, ideologically correct, end quote, and, quote, effective, end quote. End footnote. For the new dominant class, it is not enough to avoid contradictory material from spreading. It was also to be ensured that the risk of an ideological decision is reduced to the maximum extent, so that the myth of the infallibility of the leadership gets accepted. This aspect of Stalinist ideology brings Stalinist ideology quite close to the Nazi ideology, which proclaims in its part the Führerprinzip, the principle of the chief. However, the cult of the chief is also fed by other non-official but popular manifestations. Thus, the cult of the chief is rooted in forms of spontaneous manifestations which are born of the relationship of the workers and peasants themselves with the party as the organ of power. These relationships lend to the party an appearance of a higher power on which depends the daily life of each and even its survival. The respect accorded to the party is above all an expression of fear. It is concentrated on him who is at the top of the party, because the base of the party and the workers experience to a considerable extent the contradictions between the top and the cadres, out of which comes the arbitrariness and depression of an immediate and everyday nature. They often look upon the top as a recourse against the, quote, abuses, end quote, of local power. This recourse, more or less imaginary, used to function in old Russia where the, quote, protector czar, end quote, appeared as a means of defense against local authorities. During the 1930s, the situation becomes more contradictory because there is mistrust and even hate towards the top, and a certain hope reposed in it. This hope is furthermore entertained by the official cult of the supreme chief, which feeds populist politics. This politics produced all the more the effect desired by the power, because the figure of the, quote, protector, end quote, or of the, quote, father of the people, end quote, is very much a part of the czarist tradition of absolutism, that is to say, of old Russian political culture. Footnote. On this point, see the contribution by St. Cohen, Bolshevism and Stalinism, in Robert C. Tucker's edited volume, Stalinism, Essays in Historical Interpretation. I've read a couple pieces from that. End footnote. When the cult of the chief, quote, interiorized, end quote, by the masses happens to add to the official cult practiced by the party, it becomes a real social force, at least for some, during a part of the war years, for example. Some good shit here. Let me copy that down. Sorry, hello, this is annoying. Sorry about that. New section, section 3, the fetishism of the state. Stalinist ideology develops state fetishism very systematically. This comes forth spontaneously in the exercise of power, but by using it, Stalinist ideology functions in this domain as a veritable dominant ideology, and this contributes to making the authority of the party palatable as the apparatus situated at the top of the system of the state. The real illusions which give substance to state fetishism function, quote, conspicuously, end quote, because the abstract entity of the state appears as possessing a true power. It extracts its power from the very forces which the society gives to it, on the basis of a division of work which makes the state the foremost ideological power. This power is born of the dominant social relationship and the contradictions which these relationships strengthen. The development of social contradiction renders the nature of the state increasingly, quote, independent in appearance, and makes it possible to bestow upon this abstract power, and those that speak in its name, the state's name, the apparatus that can intervene in the movement of the contradiction into the class struggle. In this way is built an increasingly extended base for the, quote, supernatural power, end quote, of the state. Several passages from Marx and Engels, contrary to Stalinist ideology, deal with the critique of state fetishism and develop the thesis of the withering of the state with the disappearance of the antagonistic classes. Quote, the moment there are no longer any social classes to be held in oppression, the moment the collisions and excesses resulting from it are eliminated, along with the domination of class and the struggle for individual existence, motivated by earlier anarchy of production, there is no longer anything to be put down which necessitates a power of oppression or a state, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. The thesis of the, quote, disappearance, end quote, of all political power can, of course, be debated. One can cast doubt on the idea that in a complex society, contradictions are not inevitable, and that their mediation does not need institutional forms of the state. However, even if we doubt some of the conclusions of Marx and Engels, it is no less true that the sharpening or diminution of social contradiction should obviously be accompanied by a process of strengthening or of, quote, withering, end quote, of the coercive role of the state. Therefore, the strengthening of this role in the, quote, Soviet, end quote, social formation in the 1930s is undoubtedly the result of an increase in social contradictions and, in particular, of the struggle of the new dominant class for an increase of this dominant class's authority and this dominant class's privileges. Stalinist ideology does not pose the problem in these terms. Stalinist ideology asserts that the supposed weakening of social contradictions should not lead to a corresponding weakening of the strength of the state, but on the contrary to the state's strengthening. Footnote. The identification of the increase of the authority of the state to the development of liberty is a matter that haunts the Russian autocracy and despotism in general. Therefore, it is no chance that in the Legend of the Grand Inquisitor, Dostoevsky makes him say that, quote, the organization of total liberty passes by the setting up of an absolute dictatorship, end quote. End footnote. Wikipedia says The Grand Inquisitor is a story within a story, called a poem by its fictional character, contained within Fyodor Dostoevsky's 1880 novel The Brothers Karamazov. The Grand Inquisitor is recited by Ivan Fyodorovich Karamazov during a conversation with his brother Alexei, a novice monk, about the possibility of a personal and benevolent God. The, quote, Grand Inquisitor is an important, or the text, the Grand Inquisitor story is an important part of the novel and one of the best-known passages in modern literature because of its ideas about human nature and freedom. In a long diatribe directed at Jesus himself, who was returned to earth in Seville At the height of the Inquisition, the Grand Inquisitor defends the following ideas. Only the principles of the devil can lead to mankind's unification. Give man bread, control his conscience, and rule the world. Jesus limited himself to a small group of chosen ones, while the Catholic Church improved on his work and addressed all people. The Church rules the world in the name of God, but with the devil's principles. Jesus was mistaken in holding man in high esteem. Jesus remained silent throughout the Inquisitor's speech. Scholars cite Friedrich Schiller's play Don Carlos of 1787 as a major inspiration for Dostoevsky's The Grand Inquisitor, while also noting that, quote, the sources of the legend are extraordinarily varied and complex, end quote. Back to the text. New section. New heading. Heading A. The Stalinist thesis of the strengthening of the state. It is in the 1930s, at the 16th Party Congress, that Stalin enunciates the thesis that the withering of the state would occur through its reinforcement. Footnote: on this point, see the article Stalin and the State in number 24 of Communism, especially the section on, quote, the maximum reinforcement of the state, end quote, as the path of its withering. End footnote. This theoretical rupture is seen again in the report which Stalin presents in January 1933 in the balance sheet of the first five-year plan which Stalin prepared. In this report, the General Secretary of the party once again asserts that the, quote, withering of the state will not come about by the weakening of the state power, but by the state power strengthening to the maximum, end quote. Stalin. Footnote: see Stalin, balance sheet of the first five-year plan presented to the plenum of the 7th of January, 1933, in Questions of Leninism, published in Paris, 1969, in French. It would be interesting, though, as a side note, but Trotsky said a very similar thing, is that, you know, the disappearance of the state is preceded by the maximal extension of the state, the maximum dictatorial power of the state. And he used the analogy of like a light bulb that flashes before it burns out. Yeah, I feel like there's probably something of that nature within Bolshevism itself, since it's shared by the both sides of the post-Lenin power struggle. Anyway, the fact that such an assertion is in contradiction to the classical theses upheld by Marx, Engels, and Lenin renders the position of Stalin, quote, theoretically uncomfortable, end quote, especially at a time when the USSR is supposed to have become a, quote, socialist state, end quote. This undoubtedly explains why in Stalin's report presented in 1936 on the new constitution, Stalin does not deal directly with the theoretical problem of the state in a society supposed to be socialist and therefore, quote, freed from the antagonism of classes, end quote. The General Secretary observes the same silence on this question in his 1938 work on Dialectical Materialism and Historical Materialism. Wikipedia says Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Joseph Stalin is a central text within the Soviet Union's political theory, Marxism-Leninism. Dialectical and Historical Materialism first appeared as a chapter in the short history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which drew heavily from the philosophical works of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin. It describes the Bolshevik Party's official doctrine on dialectical materialism and historical materialism. Back to the text. However, at this time, the theses of the withering of the state and the law, thesis accepted by the leaders of the party, is not of a classical nature, by imputing them to the old, quote, official theoretician, end quote, on the problem of state and law, Pashukanis, in parentheses, are condemned by official ideologues and denounced as the manifestations of, quote, counter-revolutionary Trotskyism, end quote. Footnote, see N. Timashev's The Great Retreat. This author cites various periodicals, end footnote. I'm not really finding any great descriptions of this book. Anyway, back to the text. Finally, Vyshinsky proclaims that Stalin had made a decisive advance in the theory of the state. Thus Vyshinsky, and I think Vyshinsky was like the main judge of the purges, Thus Vyshinsky writes, quote, Lenin had shared the idea of the withering of the state, but Stalin has introduced a correction and proved that under socialism the state should be strengthened. Consequently, the law should also follow and become socialist. Everywhere in the world, those who are in power violate the law and the rights of the individual. There is only one country where, like pure gold, justice shines, and it is the Soviet Union. End quote. Vyshinsky. Wikipedia says Andrei Vyshinsky, who lived from 1883 to 1954, was a Soviet politician, jurist, and diplomat. Andrei Vyshinsky is best known as a state prosecutor of Joseph Stalin's Moscow trials and in the Nuremberg trials. Vyshinsky was the Soviet foreign minister from 1949 to 1953, after having served as deputy foreign minister under Vyacheslav Molotov since 1940. Andrei Vyshinsky headed the Institute of State and Law in the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union. Back to the text. Such a text written when arbitrary arrests, convictions, and deportations were ever on the increase illustrates not only the glorification of the, quote, new theory, end quote, but its function of mystification in reality. Finally, in 1939, in his report of the 10th of March to the 18th Congress, Stalin openly breaks away from, quote, classical and, quote, theoretical positions. Stalin declares on this occasion that the formulation of Engels, which is earlier cited, is a, quote, general formula, end quote, which cannot be extended, quote, to the special and concrete case of the victory of socialism in a single country, end quote, because according to Stalin, it, quote, should have a sufficiently strong state, end quote, to be able to defend the conquest of socialism against attacks from outside, end quote. Stalin, Questions of Leninism. But Stalin lets it be understood that this withering could intervene, quote, if the victory of socialism, end quote, were to be achieved on a larger scale than that of a single country. New section, B. Negation of the, quote, regressive function, end quote, of the state. In the report cited above, Stalin implicitly distances himself from the question of the, quote, function of repression, end quote, and does so in a paradoxical manner. Stalin denies that the Soviet state exercises such a function. In fact, Stalin declares, quote, Because exploitation is suppressed, the exploiters no longer exist. There is no one to be repressed. Stalin. This assertion, enumerated when millions of men and women are deported, rests, if one may say so, on a, quote, play on words, and, quote, typical of the code used by the official language. In fact, Stalin specifies that the, quote, function of repression is replaced by the function of protection of socialist property against the thieves and misappropriators of public property, end quote. And by the, quote, functions of military defense, end quote. In fact, Stalin specifies that, quote, the function of repression is replaced by the function of misappropriation of public property, end quote, and by the, quote, function of military defense, end quote. It is, therefore, these functions and not the repression, exclamation point, which requires the existence of a large police force, army, and the, quote, intelligence services necessary to capture and punish the spies, assassins, and those engaged in sabotage, end quote. Stalin. Questions of Leninism. Thanks to this code language, the activity of the police and corrective organisms, howsoever directed against innumerable workers and peasants, becomes a function of, quote, protection of the people, end quote. By identifying the state and the people, Stalinist ideology justifies the widest possible repression. Not yielding to the state is not being one of the people. Not yielding to the state is being the people's enemy, so much so that one must logically conclude, in the words of Solzhenitsyn, that the people have become their own enemy, end quote. State fetishism and the official negation of repression lead to another code language which brings forth the terms of, quote, education and, quote, re-education, end quote. Vyshinsky, chief public prosecutor of the USSR from 1935 to 1940, explicitly cites these terms. Vyshinsky states that the state should, quote, guide the large masses of the population, end quote, and goes on to add that this involves a task of educating where, quote, an exceptional role devolves in organs such as the courts, end quote, and the institutions of, quote, correctional work, end quote. Footnote. See A. Vyshinsky, The Law of the Socialist State, Russian edition of 1938, translated in London, 1948. See also the preface to the collection From Prisons to the Establishments for Education, published in Moscow, 1934. And footnote. Wait, actually, I wanted to look up this book. Sorry. The description for this book says, every Soviet student of government and law read Vyshinsky's book. It is, in a sense, the militant handbook of those engaged in Soviet government. It provides a guide through the intricacies of the central and local levels of administration, an explanation of the Constitution, and a documented analysis of the laws relating to the courts, elections, and rights and duties of citizens. It was designed also as a means of instilling in the public official a firm conviction that they were part of a system of government which had no equal in the world outside. This is republished by Leica Press. Just curious to want to look this up. looks like some douchey Stalinist shit. Anyway, back to the text and footnote. This, quote, educative activity should, quote, purify the conscience of the people, end quote. The class character of the state said to be, quote, socialist, end quote, becomes very clear here. One of the tasks is to enforce the people to be disciplined by forging in the people a, quote, human conscience, end quote, that is respectful of, quote, social and civic duties, end quote, aimed at a total subordination of all to work. The Stalinist fetishism of the state and its apologia covers a theory and practice of total subordination of all workers to an authority which is quite external to them and on which they can exercise no control whatever. As for the, quote, defense of socialist legality, end quote, as invoked by Wyszynski, we notice that in practice it leads only to imposing, quote, duties, end quote, to the individuals facing the all-powerful state and does not give individuals any right. New section C, the state, the rights of the individual, and the 1936 Constitution. In Stalinist ideological discourse, things do not appear in this manner but in an inverted form, that of the defense of individuals against the arbitrariness of the state. The Constitution of 1936 and official commentaries which accompany its discussion and promulgation yield a new typical example of an inversion of reality in Stalinist ideology. Let us allude to some facts. On the 5th of December 1936, while mass repression is already let loose in the country, and while it engulfs the leading party itself, the 8th Extraordinary Congress of Soviets adopts a new constitution. This is supposed to incorporate, quote, the balance sheet of the conquest already made, end quote, and to ensure a, quote, consequent and unfailing democratism, end quote. Footnote. See the report of Stalin on the 25th of December 1936 to the 8th Congress and the text of the Constitution in the new Constitution of the USSR. End footnote. As far as the rights of individuals are concerned, Chapter 9 of the Constitution enunciates an apparently important discourse. Chapter 9 deals with tribunals and prosecution agencies and asserts that judges are independent and are answerable only to the law. Quote, judges are independent and are answerable only to the law, end quote. Article 112, that, quote, the right of defense is guaranteed to the accused, end quote. And that, quote, the hearings at all the tribunals are public, end quote. Article 11. Now this constitutional provision is in contradiction not only with everyday practice but also with official legal doctrine. Thus a Soviet jurist was arrested in a comment on this doctrine. Thus a Soviet jurist has asserted in a comment on this doctrine, quote, one shall remember that the independence of the judges and the judges' subordinates only before the law does not mean independence from the state or independence from the policies of the party and the government, because the court is an organ of the power and the court's function is one of the functions of the state, end quote. M.V. Kozhnevnikov, something in Russian. Leonard Shapiro, who cites this text, goes on to note further that since 1931, almost all the judges are members of the party. And therefore subject to the party's discipline. And footnote. Moreover, no legislative provision is likely to be strengthened by any kind of, quote, independence, end quote, of the judges. The official stand of the Constitution is particularly mystifying insofar as civil liberties are concerned. These are enumerated in Articles 124 to 128. They include the freedom of speech, press, gatherings, processions, and demonstrations in the streets, the freedom to form social organizations, the, quote, inviolability of the person, end quote, Article 127, of, quote, home, and of, quote, correspondence, Article 128. And all these liberties are constantly trampled upon by the NKVD, and the citizens can take no step against its decisions. The same mystification on the subject of elections. According to the text of the Constitution, Article 134, these are henceforth held under universal suffrage, equal and direct, by, quote, secret vote, end quote, Article 134. All the earlier restrictions stand abolished, especially those that hit peasants whose, quote, votes counted, end quote, far less than those earning salaries. According to Article 141, all sorts of associations and organizations can present candidates and on the, quote, decisions of the majority of voters, end quote. Members of the legislative bodies can be relieved of their mandate. These provisions have practically no importance whatsoever. In fact, candidates can only be set up with the agreement of the party, and the party only proposes one candidate per constituency. Secrecy of voting is not respected. As there is only one candidate, he who enters the secret enclosure of the ballot box can be suspected to be doing so to strike off the name of the official candidate. Footnote: on these points, see the observation of L. Shapiro and the Communist Party, the book. Moreover, those that are set up receive about 98% of the votes cast. Footnote: during the 1937 elections to the Supreme Soviet, there was officially 98.6% voting, and those elected received on average 98% of the votes. 81% of those elected are members of the party, against 73.8% in the earlier Congress of Soviets, elected within the framework of the 1925 Constitution. End footnote. This did not prevent a large number of legislators being eliminated after the Constitution came into force as, quote, enemies of the people, end quote. Such is especially the case of 6 of the 7 presidents of the executive elected by the Congress and almost all its members and alternate members. This, quote, elimination, end quote, then resulted in execution or deportation. The Stalinist ideology of the state and of its relationship with citizens thus enunciates a double discourse. A, quote, democratic, end quote, discourse, which is in contradiction with facts, and an absolutist and repressive discourse, which is a commentary on actual practice. This duality is an expression of a social schizophrenia. It reflects the deep contradictions of an economic and political system which pretends to act in the name of the working masses, even as it oppresses those masses, subjects them to repression, and exploits them with an intensity rarely attained in history. New section, Section D, the specific form of Stalinist state fetishism and Bolshevik ideology. It is important to emphasize that the specific form of Stalinist state fetishism and the political relationship which this fetishization nourishes, and which this state fetishism feeds on, has its roots not only in the Russian past. It is present in the embryonic form in Bolshevik ideology. It is the concrete circumstances by which the formation of the, quote, society, end quote, passed, which gave to it its Stalinist and later its post-Stalinist historical form. The Bolshevik ideological formation carries in it a new symbolism which enables the face of the party to incarnate the proletariat, people, revolution, knowledge, practice, etc. Footnote. See Claude Lafleur, Les Inventions Démocratiques. The description of this book says, unlike many intellectuals of his generation, Claude Lafleur can claim a rare consistency in his analysis of communist regimes, which he described as totalitarian as early as 1956. Indeed, he said that earlier. For 35 years, Lafleur worked tirelessly to dismantle the political and ideological mechanisms of a system that aimed for complete domination of social life, and no less to detect all the signs of the irreducible gap between the totalitarian project and actual reality. The text published in 1981 expresses conviction that the collapse of communism is inevitable. This judgment stems from a political vision of modern societies. For Claude Lafleur, knowledge of communism cannot be dissociated from a reflection on democracy. To those who have put communism on trial based on a theory of how the economy works in industrial societies, Lafleur counters that this regime's primary target was civil and political liberties. That stems from a revolution that is far more anti-democratic than anti-capitalist. This sheds light on the current crisis in countries emerging from communism. In part, the economic liberalism that accompanies the unleashing of market violence indicates the root of communist ideology, or the route of communist ideology. But is it not remarkable that it finds a privileged terrain in societies dismantled by totalitarian domination, where the notion of law, association, and collective resistance have been erased from the population? More than ever, the question arises, what is democratic invention? Back to the text and footnote. Come on, you son of a bitch. Alright. Back to the text and footnote. The October insurrection gives a form to this symbolism and thus inaugurates a new system of representation, which sets off the emergence of a new type of state where the face of the party asserts itself increasingly as social power over itself by the society whose contradictions are abolished in its imagination, so much so that it is visualized as a totality which can only be doubted by the, quote, enemies. This power visualizes itself as universal and with the gift of knowledge and the capacity of laying down the law. Incapable of really controlling economic and social forces, the Stalinist party tries to break all that comes in the way of its decisions, whether these obstacles come from the people, cages, or concrete or theoretical data, or the rules of morality or whatever kind. The party exists as an organization which incarnates the unity of the people. The democracy which presents itself as this kind of power is the dictatorship of the people. By its very nature, it asserts itself to be in the, quote, service of the people, end quote, because the official ideology mystifies the effective division of the society and of the state, while the privileges and the powers which multiply within these divisions are denied. It is conceived as democracy of the masses. All are organized by the party and can be mobilized to bring forth the directives fixed by the party. From it arises the concept of a real democracy as against bourgeois democracy. From it arises the concept of a real democracy as against bourgeois democracy. This real democracy has the peculiarity of not letting the people express themselves, except in order to approve the party. In concrete reality, it is negation of the freedom of the individual, but Stalinist ideology maintains that it is the supreme form of this liberty, because it lays down the rights and the duties of everyone to obey the party. Through obeying it, quote, they are only obeying themselves, end quote. Such is the ideological matrix of Stalinist totalitarianism. It throws into the, quote, wastebasket of history, end quote, the previously acquired democratic gains that are likely to serve as the starting point of a veritable social emancipation, namely the freedom of association, freedom of information, the right to go on strike, universal adult suffrage, etc. New section, Section E. The Soviet state is the successor of the Russian state. The Stalinist ideology does not restrict itself to strengthening the fetishization of the state, but gives up the notion of a transient state characterized by the role it would play in a social transformation. The role it would play in social transformation. In place of this transient state, it substitutes a durable state which is identified with the Russian state. Footnote. See H. Couvert de N. Caus. Stalin, le Ordre par la Terreur, published in 1980. The description of this book says, for a quarter of a century, Stalin dominated the Soviet political scene and held unparalleled power. Only Peter the Great had previously exercised such strong, even cruel authority over this immense country, changing people in the world around them. In 25 years, the Soviet Union was covered in factories, construction sites, and camps. A new economic and social revolution took place. A terrible war broke out. Stalin imposed an implacable order over his country, order through terror, whose history this book traces in attempts to demonstrate the mechanisms. The Stalinist order is part of a dual perspective. It depends on Russian history, always torn between Russia's specificity, Russia's Asianism, and the reformers' desire to make it a Western country. It is also marked by 20th century European history, which saw the rise of totalitarianism, Russian despot, European didactician, such are the faces of Stalin hidden by the statesman and war leader who came in 1945 to sign at the table of the victors in the camp of the defenders of freedom. Back to the text. End footnote. The Russian state was not born in 1917. The Russian state has behind the Russian state a long history, that of Russia, whose citizens are called upon to study history in order to learn better to love it. Footnote. See Richard Pipes' Pierre le Grand et le Système Russe, Peter the Great and the Russians, and the Russian System, published in Histoire, April 1981. End footnote. From 1936 onwards, the strength and role of the old Russian state are held out as positive elements of world history. Because this state has, quote, served as the bastion of Europe against great invasions, end quote. As a result of the glorification of the Russian state, the leaders of the great revolts of the past, such as Razin or Pugachev, or the Decembrists, no longer appear in a favorable light, because they have weakened a state which embodies, quote, progress. Henceforth, the true heroes are those who contributed to the building of the Russian state, such as Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great. They were the heroes of the cinema of Eisenstein and precursors of Stalin. The Ivan the Terrible movie is a good movie, but it's depressing. It's politically depressing. In terms of its context. They were heroes of the cinema of Eisenstein and precursors of Stalin. The state is the one in which the Russian nation is forged, and the Russian nation's revolutionary capabilities led to the victories of 1917 and of the Civil War. This discourse tends to fortify the Soviet state by giving the Soviet state a past and a geographical base, that of the Tsarist Empire, and to identify October with the heroism of the Russian people. On a historical plane, it subordinates the other nationalities whom the Russian people have protected from the fate of barbarians, placed them on the way to civilization, and kept them along the path of the revolution. Thus the idea of a nation is restored and grafted onto that of the state, while the Russian people become guides and mentors. Immediately after the war, Immediately after the war, a communist leader from Azerbaijan faithfully develops this ideology when he writes, quote, "The leading force which unites, cements, and guides the people of our country is our elder brother, the great Russian people. By their virtues, the Russian people deserve the confidence, respect, and love of all other peoples." End quote. Thus goes the official ideology, which covers up violent national contradictions, hatred of other nations on the part of the chauvinists of Great Russia, and the subordination of the party apparatus and the states of different republics by cadres of the guiding nation. New section, Section 4. The Russian nationalist component of the ideological formation of Stalinism. The Stalinist ideological formation at the end of the 1930s is thus characterized by a strong Russian nationalist component. This component is not foreign to Bolshevism, which very quickly poses the problem of a reconstruction of the national economy and the place of Russian industry in the world economy. The Stalinist ideological formation of the 1930s is thus characterized by a strong Russian nationalist component. This strong Russian nationalist component is not foreign to Bolshevism, which very quickly poses the problem of a reconstruction of the national economy and the place of Russian industry in the world economy. Moreover, a section of the Bolsheviks, Stalin among them, seek as early as in the 1920s to maintain the domination of Russia over the peoples, incorporated in the Tsarist Empire. This they did through the domination of the party over the totality of Soviet republics. During the 1930s, the nationalist component of the official ideology is reinforced and seen in practices seeking to ensure the preeminence of the Russian language and culture over those of the other nationalities. The ideology also orders a, quote, artistic policy, end quote, which holds up Russian literary works of earlier centuries as a model. New section A. Stalinist nationalism and the Tsarist imperial past. The fate of Stalinist nationalism is turned towards the imperial and Tsarist past. As against the Bolshevik position, Stalinism tends more and more towards glorifying the history of Russia. Thus it plays a conservative and even a reactionary role in reproducing, in general by more or less disguising it, the large number of prejudices inherited from the past. This aspect of Stalinist ideology enables it to, quote, produce a consensus, end quote, within important layers of the Russian people whose nationalism is flattered, and this contributes to, quote, legitimizing, end quote, the dominant place occupied by the Russian party and cadres all over the country. This nationalism, quote, which produces consensus, end quote, is one of the elements which gives a populist appearance to Stalinism. During the Second World War, it becomes an essential element of the official discourse, which seeks to mobilize in favor of the patriotism of the country invaded by the armies of Hitler. This discourse does not hesitate to evoke the defense of the fatherland, to which is associated the name of its supreme leader. This appeal to nationalism is seen to be infinitely more effective than invoking the defense of, quote, socialism, end quote, which has a bitter taste for the workers. After the war, this nationalism is used to flatter certain, quote, popular prejudices, on the other hand, condemned in the official discourse. The most significant of these prejudices is anti-Semitism. It is officially fought, but the censor which is always vigilant otherwise, turns a blind eye from time to time to anti-Semitic labels. At different times, the, quote, struggle against cosmopolitanism, end quote, becomes an almost open form under the anti-Semitic ideology, under which an anti-Semitic ideology is actually developed. Stalinist nationalism and the glorification of a certain Russian past fulfills yet another function because it presents the leaders of the party and the Soviet state as, quote, continuers, end quote, of the, quote, great men, end quote, of the past, such as Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great. From 1937, patriotic expressions are commonly used. Thus we find in Izvestia the, quote, word father, Thus we find in the Izvestia, quote, the word, quote, fatherland, end quote, has become a fundamental political concept, ... The most important condition for success is the combatant patriotic spirit of our nation, the unlimited fidelity to the fatherland, ... End quote. Izvestia. Footnote, cited in N. Timoshev. There's a footnote that I missed. The assertion that there is, quote, no anti-Semitism, end quote, in the USSR allows it to be perpetrated. It is known that this assertion authorizes the tribunals to condemn as, quote, anti-Soviet propaganda, end quote, those who take the risk of denouncing discriminatory measures or anti-Semitic raging. One second, I'm going to copy that down. Sorry, 1 second. Back to the text and footnote. Second. Russian nationalism, furthermore, is known to assume the form of a, quote, internationalism, end quote, when it presents Russia as the defender of other revolutions or as sustaining the struggle of the colonial peoples against oppression by, quote, Western, end quote, capitalism. At the same time, traditional internationalism becomes an expression to be used by various communist movements as instruments of Soviet foreign policy. This internationalism then appeals for the, quote, defense of the land of the Soviet, end quote, or to express solidarity with Russia. The rise of Stalinist nationalism is an expression of the victory of the national capitalist component of Bolshevism, which calls upon the exploited people to participate in the, quote, construction of the country, end quote. Thus, while nationalism pushes the dominant class to, quote, build, end quote, a strong country, it holds out to the masses the illusion of a, quote, radiant and, quote, prosperous future, end quote, for which they should pay with an increase in sacrifices and misery. Footnote. B. Kerblay speaks of a, quote, alliance brought about in the collective conscience between Marxism-Leninism and patriotism, and a, quote, drift from one to the other, end quote. B. Kerblay. Second. Looking up this book. And it just kind of seems like a textbook on the USSR. Okay, back to the text. And footnote. B. The 1936 Constitution and Russian Nationalism. Chapter 2 of the 1936 Constitution denotes a significant moment of the penetration of Russian nationalism and Stalinist ideology pertaining to law. This chapter shows the Soviet state not as an imminently transient and new political form, but as an enduring reality. It enumerates the republics which form a part of the Union and defines the powers and tasks of the Union and of the different republics. Articles 10 to 16. However, it reaffirms the right of each republic to, quote, freely secede from the USSR, end quote. Article 17. This, quote, right of secession, end quote, like many other provisions of the Constitution, is a pure deception because no concrete possibility would ever exist for the population of a republic to assert openly its desire to leave the Union. In fact, the official leaders of any given republic are members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and were duty-bound to apply the policy of the Central Committee of this party, to which they were totally subordinate by virtue of the rules of, quote, democratic centralism, end quote. Thus it could be officially said, quote, it is evident that the probability of a republic of the Soviet Union expressing its desire to secede through the democratically elected Soviet organs is so infinitely small as to be practically equal to zero, end quote. In fact, those who exercise the real functions of directing communist parties of the different republics are most often the greater Russians, because the communist leaders with origins in these republics can easily be accused of, quote, nationalist deviations, end quote. Such accusations, moreover, make their appearance soon enough. Thus, as early as in 1926, Shumsky, the Commissar for Education in the Ukraine, is accused of wishing to, quote, Ukrainize, and, quote, too rapidly the cadres of the Republic, and also of, quote, fighting against Russian culture in general and its highest expression, Leninism, end quote. Footnote, see Stalin Works, Volume 8. Wikipedia says Alexander Shumsky was a Ukrainian communist and activist. He was one of the leaders of the national communism movement in Ukraine and actively supported Ukrainization. He was one of the victims of the Stalinist regime, being arrested and killed by the NKVD in 1946. He was rehabilitated in 1958 during the period of de-Stalinization. A very good-looking man, if you were curious. What a stud. Anyway, thus as early in 1926, Shumsky, the Commissar for Education in the Ukraine, is accused of wishing to, quote, Ukrainize and, quote, too rapidly the cadres of the Republic, and also of, quote, fighting against Russian culture in general and its highest expression, Leninism, end quote. At that time, the first secretary of the Ukrainian party was Kaganovich, who relieved Shumsky of his functions in 1927. In 1933, Shumsky was arrested. The same year, Skrypnik, Skrypnik, who had succeeded Shumsky in the Commissariat of Education, committed suicide after being accused of becoming a tool in the hands of, quote, nationalist bourgeois, end quote, elements. Skripnik was a member of the party since 1897. Mykola Skripnik lived from 1872 to 1933, was a Ukrainian Bolshevik revolutionary and communist leader. He was a proponent of the Ukrainian Republic's independence and later led the cultural Ukrainization effort in Soviet Ukraine. When the policy was reversed and Skripnik was removed from his position, he committed suicide rather than be forced to recant his policies in a show trial. Mykola Skripnik also was the head of the Ukrainian People's Commissariat, equivalent to the modern-day position of Prime Minister of Ukraine. Back to the text. In the succeeding years, a large number of old members of the party in Ukraine and other republics had to face the same accusations and were eliminated. As far as national demands, which tend to be expressed through channels other than the Soviet organs, they are condemned by Article 58 of the Criminal Code of the RSFSR and the corresponding articles of the codes of other republics under the heading of, quote, counter-revolutionary agitation and propaganda, intended to undermine or weaken the Soviet regime by exploiting national prejudices of the masses, end quote, which is a specific crime. Footnote, this Article 58 is replaced since 1958 by the law on the, quote, crimes against the state, end quote, which makes similar actions punishable with a maximum of 7 years in prison plus 5 years of deportation when necessary. End footnote. By officializing the enduring character of the Soviet state and by treating it as a continuation of the Russian state, the, quote, Stalinist constitution, end quote, makes a break from the Bolshevik tradition. This rupture is seen more generally in Stalinist ideological discourse. In fact, to the end of the 1920s, it was officially recognized that the former Tsarist Empire was a, quote, prison house of the people, end quote, worse than the British Empire. Even in 1929, the as-yet official historian Prokofsky could say, quote, in the past, we Russians, and I am 100% Great Russian, we were the worst gangsters imaginable. End quote. Prokofsky. In 1936, when the new Constitution was being written, sorry, I like that quote a lot. I actually have to copy that down. Sorry about this. Thank you for your patience. Come on, you son of a gun. I hate technology. For the fucking love of Pete. Come on. In 1936, when the new constitution was being written, a positive role is attributed to Russia, so much so that expansionism is soon looked upon as an asset because of the, quote, civilizing role, unquote, of Russia, whose work was considered to be continued by the Soviet Union, but with a new content, that of class, which makes it possible to associate the peoples of the USSR in a, quote, freely agreed union, end quote. Article 13 of the Constitution. Ew, what are you? Get out of here, bug. Die, bug. I don't like you. Creepy ass bug in my room. Where am I? New section, Section C. Where am I? Okay. Section C is titled Nationalism, Elitism, and National Bolshevism. The rise of Stalinist nationalism acquires its full significance from its combination with other components of Stalinist ideology, namely the cult of the chief, a certain populism, and the respect of rigorous hierarchical distinctions, leading to the establishment of a, quote, elite supposed to be of, quote, another nature, end quote, than the, quote, ordinary people. Footnote. The, quote, elitist character of Stalinism is obviously related to the Leninist notion of, quote, vanguard, but Stalinist elitism has its own specific characteristics. It tends to justify the multiplication of privileges of the, quote, elite, that is to say, in essence, the members of the party apparatus and of the nomenclatura. End footnote. The insertion of nationalist and elitist elements in Stalinism and the role which they play makes this ideology increasingly, quote, national Bolshevism, end quote. Footnote. Its signs are chiefly the increasing role in official discourse played by the words, quote, fatherland, quote, patriotism, end quote, the land of our forefathers, end quote. End footnote. Footnote. See Mikhail Ogursky's article, An Ideology for the New Class in the USSR, National Bolshevism. End footnote. This National Bolshevism has many traits in common with Italian fascism and especially with another, quote, National Bolshevism, end quote, which had grown in Germany from 1919 to 1922 and which was one of the ideological sources of the, quote, National Revolutionaries, end quote, and then of, quote, National Socialism, end quote. Footnote. On these different ideologies, on their thematic studies, and so on. And on their language. See Jean-Pierre Fay. Language totalitaire. I don't know, totalitarian languages. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that French word right, but oh well. The existence of these common traits did not escape some ideologues of Nazism and fascism. Footnote. Such is the case especially of Renzo Bertoni, who published in 1934 a book titled Victory of Fascism in the USSR. And footnote. Among the former, we find, even in 1927, and so even before Stalinism had acquired its face in the 1930s, Erich Maulmeister. After the exclusion of Trotsky from the Politburo of the Soviet Party, Erich Maulmeister talks of a, quote, Stalinist Bolshevism, end quote, and adds that it is an idea, quote, the National Socialism of Russia. And adds that it is, as an idea, quote, the National Socialism of Russia, end quote. This theme is taken up again in 1934 by Joseph Drexel in an article in the magazine Widerstand. Drexel wrote at the time, quote, the new Russia is the Third Reich, end quote. Footnote. This reference and the previous one is found in the work of J.P. Fay. Of course, the fact that some Nazi ideologues accept that there exist affinities between the ideology to which they claim to belong and Stalinism would not fail to eliminate specific traits which place these ideologies in opposition to one another, nor the national contradictions that led to the confrontation between Nazi Germany and the Russia of Stalin. The problem of the ideological relationship between Stalinism, fascism, and Nazism is clearly far too wide to be dealt with here. One must, however, point out that these ideologies feed not only large-scale repressive practices, but also refer to an ideological power of great similarity. An ideological power of great similarity. This was already emphasized with respect to elitism and the cult of the chief, but can be extended to many other ideological themes. Thus, the notion of a, quote, correct thought and discourse is found in Nazi ideology. Footnote. This adjective, quote, correct, end quote, appears for the first time in a speech at Breslau by Himmler, where Himmler seeks to find out what can be considered as, quote, acceptable in words, writings, and deeds, end quote. End footnote. The, quote, abolition, end quote, of the proletariat in Stalinist discourses, about which Stalin had said in 1936 that it does not exist anymore in the USSR, and that it has been replaced by a new type of working class, is not only not without any analogy either with the opposition between, quote, proletariat and, quote, worker, which we come across in Ernst Junger, for whom the second term puts in a nutshell a very great, quote, positivity, end quote, because there's a connotation of technique. Nazi ideology, like Stalinist ideology, thus speaks of a, quote, workerism, end quote, which makes it possible to exert in the name of, quote, the workers, end quote, the oppressive practices of which they are the main victims. There's a paper that I haven't read. It's by like a mainstream, like not orthodox, what's the word? Like a mainstream, he's not a Marxist or a socialist, I don't think. He might be a socialist, maybe. I just don't know. but he's writing in the capacity as an academic. I guess I should say that. And he has a paper called Stalin's Anti-Worker Workerism, which I'd really like to read. It may also be noted that Stalinist workerism makes it possible to repress real workers, and hence every time their behavior is far from that of the model worker in this discourse in official novels and films. In the eyes of the authorities, these workers cease to be, quote, true workers, end quote. They are lazy and egoist, quote, petit bourgeois, end quote. Official discourse easily finds an explanation of such loss of values in the peasant origins of these workers. The Stalinist workerism also draws on the myth of origins, as does Nazism. Thus, when an important cadre of the party would want to eliminate someone whom he finds troublesome, he would have his background examined if his ancestors were not workers, and in this case, his, quote, bad origin, end quote, is enough to make him suspect and therefore guilty. These various remarks throw light on the specific nature of Stalinist ideology in the domain of politics and law. They also show how closely the most diverse elements are linked. We may mention, among others, 1. A largely dogmatic version of Marxism-Leninism. This version has evolved over time as the, quote, exigencies of the moment demanded it. However, we can consider this version found its canonic form in Chapter 4 of the History of the Communist Party of the USSR Bolshevik. One second. Footnote. The translation of this book at Bureau d'édition. The translation of the History of the Communist Party Bolshevik. The propositions advanced there are furthermore interpreted by the ideological authorities of the party as the need for them arose at that time, and they were clarified by the Vazd, again, chief. 2. A Russian nationalism which glorified the czarist past of the country, its historic mission, and the progressive role of its great men, including the bloodiest czars most indifferent to the fate of the workers. 3. A, quote, demonism, end quote, which bursts forth each time it is necessary to the power. Satanic elements which only strive to harm. These are, quote, monsters, and, quote, demons, and, quote, lustful vipers, end quote, denounced by Vyshinsky and his collaborators during the Moscow trials. This, quote, demonism is not without influence on the popular layers, who are still given to a large number of superstitions. Thus a large number of the, quote, enemies of the people, end quote, can be denounced even though they come up from the people themselves. 4. A fetishism of the state which has multiple appearances, such as the cult of the party and its chief, cult of the police as the, quote, glorious sword of the proletariat, end quote, and as, quote, protector of the people, end quote, assertion of the mastery of the party and the state over social development. 5. A discourse of socialist requirements and legalities, a discourse that is uttered whenever it is possible with a detailed legalism. This legalism does not exclude total arbitrariness, the, quote, confessions and, quote, depositions being extracted by every possible means. This discourse on, quote, legality, end quote, is chiefly developed in the second part of the 1930s and is used for several ends. Immediately it enables the members of the party to be judged and found guilty by an assertion that the law should be the same for all, whereas till the mid-1930s the members of the party were relatively protected against the actions of the police, who had to obtain a prior authorization of the higher members of the party to proceed against them. But this, quote, legalism, end quote, also contains, for the future, a promise of stability and anticipation, a promise to which the cadres of the party are especially sensitive at a time when the legality of the state is not respected and where they are constantly under the danger of a second legality, political legality, that of terror, included in a legislation of exception. I'm going to repeat that because there's a lot of italics in it. But this, quote, legalism, end quote, also contains for the future a promise of stability and anticipation, a promise to which the cadres of the party are especially sensitive at a time when the legality of the state is not respected and where they are constantly under the danger of a second legality, political legality, that of terror, included in a legislation of exception. Footnote. This point was especially brought out by Helene Carrère de Encausse in her contribution to the Round Table discussion of EHESS devoted to Soviet industrialization in the 1930s. See her paper, Permanences and Changes of Political Power in the Years of Industrialization, 1928 to 1941. End footnote. Thus, during the 1930s, at the political and legal level, the Stalinist ideological formation represents a mixture of extremely diverse elements, which lends to this ideological formation the chance of justifying its highly contradictory actions and of generating a response in the very different layers of the population. Here they can see themselves in reflection as also their familiar, quote, values, end quote, formed of a history of oppression over centuries. Okay, so that is the end of section 1 of part 1. Section 1 of chapter 1 of Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, Third Period, 1930 to 1941, Part 2, The Dominators. Part 1 of the book is titled Absolute Secretary and the Proletarian Fetish. Section 1, Section 1. See, it's funny because the reason, one of the reasons I'm struggling with this anyway is because part 1 is actually chapter 1 in the index. So chapter 1, Absolute Secretary and the Proletarian Fetish, and the section I just read is titled Ideological Themes and Practices of Stalinism. And the next chapter is titled Economic Ideology of Stalinism. Thank you so much for listening.